For 71 years, he told no one. Not his wife, not his children, not the priest who buried his brothers in arms, one by one, until he was the last man standing who had been inside that hangar. His name was Walter Hensley, and in July of 1947, he was a 23-year-old Army Air Forces sergeant stationed at Roswell Army Airfield, assigned to a logistics unit that had no business anywhere near what came down outside of town. He is 94 years old now, and 3 weeks ago, sitting in a small assisted living facility in rural New Mexico, he decided he was done keeping the secret. This is his account, told largely in his own words, reconstructed from hours of recorded conversation before he passed away peacefully in his sleep 11 days after speaking to us. Walter said it began with a phone call in the middle of the night. Not to him directly, he wasn't important enough for that, but to his commanding officer, who woke the barracks before dawn and loaded 2 trucks with men who were told only that there had been a crash on a ranch northwest of town and that they were going to secure the site. Nobody used the word aircraft. Nobody used the word weather balloon either, not yet. That explanation, Walter said, came later, and it came from men who had never set foot on the ranch. When they arrived, the debris field stretched for what Walter estimated was several hundred yards. He described metal that looked like tinfoil, but could not be crumpled, that returned to its original shape no matter how many times the men tried to fold it. He described symbols on some of the fragments that resembled hieroglyphics, but matched no language any of the soldiers recognized. And he described something else, something he said he had never spoken aloud until the week before he died. A second, smaller site, roughly 2 miles from the main debris field, cordoned off separately, guarded by officers Walter had never seen before and would never see again. He was ordered to help load crates onto a truck bound for that second site. He was not permitted to look inside the crates, but one of them, he said, was dropped, and the corner split open just enough for him to see inside for perhaps 2 seconds before an officer shoved him backward and screamed at him to keep his eyes forward. What he says he saw in those 2 seconds was a hand. Not a human hand, 4 fingers, unusually long, a texture like grayish leather, motionless. He assumed it was dead. He was told, within the hour, that he had seen nothing, that he would sign a document acknowledging the sensitivity of national security matters, and that any deviation from that understanding would result in consequences he did not want to discover. Walter kept that promise for the rest of his working life. He went on to serve 2 more decades in the Air Force, retired as a master sergeant, raised 3 children in Albuquerque, and by every account, lived an unremarkable, dignified American life. But he told us that not a single year passed without him thinking about that hand. He said he tried, more than once, to convince himself it had been a doll, a prop, a training mannequin left carelessly in a crate. He said the older he got, the harder that explanation became to believe, because dolls do not require 3 separate teams of armed guards and a chain of command that went, in his words, higher than anyone at that base had any right to reach. In the years since 1947, Walter watched the official story change more times than he could count. Weather balloon. Then Project Mogul, a classified balloon array meant to detect Soviet nuclear tests. Then, decades later, an Air Force report attributing later testimonies to misidentified crash test dummies from high-altitude research conducted in the 1950s, an explanation Walter dismissed immediately, since his encounter predated those experiments by nearly a decade. He said every new cover story felt less like clarification and more like erosion, a slow campaign to make an entire generation of witnesses sound senile or confused before they could be believed. What finally made him talk, he said, wasn't guilt, it was time. He had outlived every man who was on that base with him. There was no one left to protect, no unit to embarrass, no chain of command to answer to. His daughter, who sat beside him during much of the recorded conversation, said her father cried only once during the entire process, not when describing the crash, and not when describing the crates, but when he said, quietly, "I just wanted someone to know, before I went, that I wasn't lying, and I wasn't crazy." Skeptics will point out, correctly, that memory fades and reshapes itself across 7 decades, that Roswell has become so culturally saturated with mythology that even genuine witnesses may unconsciously absorb details from the stories told about them. That is a fair and necessary caution, and we do not dismiss it. But Walter's account was strikingly consistent across 3 separate interviews conducted weeks apart, contained no reference to popular Roswell mythology that postdated his own military service, and included operational details, unit movements, radio frequencies, transport logistics that aligned closely with declassified military records from that period, records Walter, by his family's account, had never read. Whatever happened outside Roswell in July of 1947 remains, formally, an open question, one buried under 70 years of denial, redaction, and convenient reclassification. But for one 94-year-old sergeant, the question was never open. It was answered the moment he saw what was inside that crate, and he carried that answer, silently, for the rest of his life. He asked us to make sure people heard it before it disappeared with him. Now you have.